Can you tell us a little bit about how this deal came about and how your trip to the US was?
Well, Jason, firstly, thank you very much for your perseverance. My apologies. I don't know whether it's settings of link or whatever, but we've tried every which way to get in, but I just can't get in with microphone and with video. So I'm happy to push out the other side, but let me just say a few words and then we've got lots of questions. So I'll go there. Look, obviously the headline stealer was the announcement around the subs that had been many months in the making. For some reason, in a system that doesn't always hold tight across three governments, we were able to hold this announcement until the Prime Minister Johnson and the President were able to make the announcement. Obviously, it goes toward the reality of our situation in the Indo-Pacific at the moment. We are increasingly concerned about the build-up of military might from China. We're worried about what activity might take place in relation to Taiwan, what the American response would be to that. We've obviously got a very significant asset in the Collins class at the moment, but it's coming toward the end of its life over the next 10 to 20 years, and we need to replace it. We made a judgment that the diesel submarine wasn't adequate, wasn't appropriate, and we had the opportunity to go with the American or the US platforms. We're in that phase now where we've already started discussions with them about whether the US or the UK provides the better option for us. That's the headline of the deal, but it goes much deeper than that, as many on the call would appreciate. We've got a very significant arrangement from the United States in terms of sustainment and maintenance for not only visiting maritime assets, including submarines, but also air assets as well. That's a significant opportunity for us. And we've also got a lot within this deal, some of it classified in relation to space and cyber. A very significant focus on cyber for obvious reasons. Also in relation to quantum computing, AI, and other elements that we're working on with the Americans in particular, but with the British as well. So let me leave it there, just a very quick snapshot of what it is we've arrived at under AUKUS, and I'll be able to expand on that a little bit through the questions.
All right, Peter, I've got my first question is from Barrett Cross, who says, have any arrangements been made to purchase or lease submarines to fill the gap until 2040? Why not purchase 8 off the shelf?
Well, Barry, it's a good question. It's a common one that's put, and I'd love to say it's like going down to the Range Rover dealership and ordering what they've got off the floor. But the reality is that the Americans, like the Brits, like the French for that matter, are really ramping up their own production at the moment, and there are just no vessels, no boats lying around. There is some opportunity for joint crewing for some which exist within the fleet at the moment, both British and the US fleet, and that may be an option for us. That will increase over time and will provide us with some capability, but there is just nothing off the shelf. I went to Connecticut when I was in the US to look at their production line there. They are producing 2 boats a year at the moment, and they've got a new class coming online, which will mean that they're producing 3 vessels a year, and that really maxes them out. So if we could increase that production. So there are some options that we're looking at. I'm not saying it's without some prospect that we could look at extending the life of one of their vessels at the moment. In the case of the US, either a Los Angeles class or their San Francisco, their other classes that could be available. But look, it's not as easy as just walking into the showroom and taking one that's from last year's model. It's a complex business, and we just haven't got the staff trained for it at this point in time either.
John Chambers asks, given the Royal Australian Navy, in particular the submarine service, has absolutely no experience with the operation and maintenance of nuclear-powered vessels. What is the strategic direction that will be implemented to enable the men and women of the RAN, in particular submariners, to achieve the necessary competence to man, operate and maintain the new vessels?
Well, John, it's a great question, and it's been a part of the discussion in both London and in Washington. There is agreement to have our people embedded within their respective programs. There is already some hosting of our submariners on some of the vessels that are nuclear powered, but there's restrictions to what parts of the vessel they can have. So we do have the ability to ramp that up. We do have the ability to join crew, and we'll work toward that, but it will take some time. It's not a capability that we're going to build up overnight. Part of the consideration of whether we would go with the French Barracuda or whether we would look at the US or the UK has to do with the nuclear industry, the domestic industry element. Now, with the Barracuda, you have a requirement to refuel that mid-life and probably a second time over the course of the life of the vessel. In the US and the UK platforms, that reactor doesn't need to be refueled for the term of that life. So it could be 30, 35 years where you don't need to refuel the reactor. So it's obviously a much simpler, I say flippantly, because nothing to do with nuclear energy is easy or simple, but it does mean that we don't need the form that we would if we went with a refueling option. And it does mean that the reactor comes intact in a modular sense, and it makes it much easier for that to be fitted as part of a new submarine. So that again takes time and skill, expertise, but that is part of the agreement to upskill our people as quickly as we can.
Thank you. David Wood asks, France has been a friend of Australia for many years. Going forward, how can Australia work with France in the Asia Pacific to promote regional stability?
Well, again, it's a good question. And already we had conducted joint exercises with the French. We'll continue to do that. They've got significant equities in the region, including, of course, in New Caledonia. They too are worried about the posture of the Chinese Communist Party at the moment. They have put together additional visits into the Indo-Pacific. And look, it's difficult. It's going to take some time for us to restore the relationship with the French. We would be angry and upset if we had a contract of this scale, this magnitude cancelled. And we accept that, and we factored that in as part of the decision making to cancel the contract with Naval Group. So we'll work with them very closely as we have done in the past. President Macron has his election coming up in April of next year, so I suspect we'll be on ice until that point, and then hopefully after the election we can continue to work very closely with them because they're an important partner, and we're mindful of the relationship and keen to restore it as quickly as we can.
Now, normally I wouldn't do this, but I'm going to let John Crawford butt in at this point. He said, Mr. Dutton, I've heard Western Australia named as the base for the proposed new submarine fleet. Surely it would be sensible to also have an East Coast facility such as Jervis Bay to ensure adequate coverage of the Pacific. Is this being considered?
A short answer is yes, John. I do think there is an argument for an East Coast base, and it also helps with recruitment. If you've got an international recruitment campaign, which is part of what we will have to undertake, then there is a great attractiveness, I think, to people being based on the East Coast. There's also strategic utility in it as well, and to deal with the scale that we're talking about, particularly with visits in addition to our own boats, I think there is a pretty strong argument for an East Coast base. So and again, it was part of the discussion with Secretary Austin in Washington, and we're scoping that out at the moment.
Has the alliance considered the effect of the creation of the alliance on other Pacific nations?
Yes, we have, and we've been very keen in our discussions in person. We went to Indonesia, to New Delhi, and also to Seoul on our way to Washington. We had discussions, obviously, with those key partners. We've had discussions, in my case, with defence counterparts since the AUKUS announcement. We've been very keen to point out the primacy of ASEAN, and we've been very keen to talk also about the Quad, which involves Japan, India, the United States, and Australia. Look, there's a different relationship in Indonesia than there is in Brunei in terms of China, as there is between Malaysia and Vietnam. So there's a complex web of economic compromise. The Chinese obviously are heavily invested into a number of these markets, and there are some private conversations you can have with some of these nations which are very sympathetic toward our position and the fact that we are, through this announcement, providing an extra layer of security and stability in the region. But publicly, people are, obviously living with the reality of the investment of the Communist Party in their own economies, building of infrastructure, etc. So we just need to deal with that diplomatically on a case-by-case basis. But it's fair to say, publicly and privately, there's pretty significant support for the announcement we made.
Ekai Ko, so that was Robert Moyne who asked that question. Ekai Ko adds that, and I think you possibly covered this already, how will this impact our Southeast Asian neighbours, ASEAN, and how will Australia manage the concern and worries about growing unease in our region?
Well, again, it's a good question. I mean, if you look at the case of Japan in the East China Sea at the moment, they are very concerned about the activity of the PLA, not just the Navy, but the fact that they've now armed the Chinese have now armed they want to call them a Coast Guard, but essentially a Navy and Coast Guard uniform. They've got a constant presence in the East China Sea, constantly challenging the Japanese. The Vietnamese obviously have had their own experience of the bullying taking place. Some of this is public, some of it's not. And I think most of them have their own experience with, either having their waters fished by Chinese fishermen. They've had a surge of vessels to intimidate their own naval activities, or as I say, in the case of the East China Sea, it's pretty willing, and the real risk of miscalculation here is something that we've all factored in. A vessel being knocked up against another one can trigger a series of events that can be very unfortunate, and I think, again, we're living with that reality. These countries are living with that reality, and I think they're seeing the activity on a scale that for them now puts into perspective what we've announced. I mean, that they see what we've announced through AUKUS as common sense, and hopefully it provides a deterrent value against China's aggression.
So, Minister, before you came on, I was asked, Greg Jennett from the ABC is saying that the subs will be built in the United States. Do we know the answer to that yet, or do we know what sort of arrangements there'll be?
Well, our intention is for them to be built in Australia, but again, there may be a staged approach. There's at least a competitive tension now that we didn't have in the contract with the French, where the US and the UK are keen to be heavily involved. as I say, with their own platforms. So we're negotiating over the course of this next 12 to 18 months, and then we'll make an announcement. But at the moment, our desire is, and our intention is to have them built in Osborne in South Australia, and that's the basis on which we're working at the moment.
So Matt Henricks asked, what is the government doing to improve our international relations with key allies aside from the UK and the US? But also GS has asked, while I, being GS, is very supportive of the direction that we've taken, he's equally interested in understanding how we can work better with China. What insights can the Minister share here?
Well, thanks, Matt and GS. So a couple of points. I mean, firstly, I just don't think anybody can point to a change in Australia's values or our respect of the relationship with China. We want a strong relationship. We've got a very important trading partner. We just don't want to have a situation where China believes it can act outside of the rule of law. The industrial scale of cyber attack, of IP theft, not just in Australia but around the world at the moment, is well known. So it's very hard to point to what we could do differently in our engagement with China. We haven't sought an uneasy relationship, but we're not going to surrender our sovereignty. As you know, the ambassador in Canberra released his 14 dot points of how we can improve relations, but essentially you're talking about giving away sovereignty, doing away with democracy. It's just an absurd proposition. So I hope that we can have a better relationship with China soon, but I don't know what it is that Australia is expected to do to get to that refresh point. It's a very difficult and vexed situation at the moment, and I think frankly other countries are finding that. And I gave a few examples before, but in private, a lot of these countries are very worried. And I mean, we've got excellent relations with India, with Japan, with Vietnam, Indonesia. The list goes on, and I think there is a deep level of concern across the Indo-Pacific and beyond. I mean, you've now got a German frigate, the UK, who's coming through at the moment. NATO has expressed concern. This is not a problem that Australia is making, but we need to deal with the reality. If, as I said in my opening remarks, China decides to go into Taiwan, what does that mean by way of response from the Americans, and what might that trigger for Australia? So we're very conscious of all the relationships, very determined to make sure that they understand our position, and it's ultimately, though, the case that we're just not going to compromise on our values, and certainly going to compromise on our approach to the relationship.
So Chris Williams from HI Fraser in my electorate asks, as an ex-Collins submarine navigator, I applaud the government's decision to acquire nuclear submarines. We currently provide valves to all of the current Australian fleet. We now have no valve or pump work on the Attack or the Hunter program. It is disappointing that Australia is not using the existing onshore capability. When will we have the chance to quote to win work for the future nuclear submarine program? And I'll just add, Julie McHale asks, will the new agreement bring more opportunities for Australian SMEs, or will work shift towards large US, UK primes?
Well, just to deal with the last question first, I think we've demonstrated over the last few years how we've been able to build up the amount of opportunity for SMEs, small industrial warehouses, tilt slab, 1 and 2 person or 1 and 200 person operations that have benefited through different defence contracts. So there's been a very deliberate strategy to work up the opportunities for Australian industry, and we want that sovereign capability. So wherever we can, then we will go with an Australian option. But in some circumstances, the IP is not held here. The opportunity is not here for an Australian company to deliver, that particular component or fulfil that particular contract. Just in, excuse me, in relation to Chris's question. So, my understanding is that the Chris's company, HI Fraser, are a supplier to obviously ASC in terms of the Collins class and James Fisher Defence Australia. The ASC, in relation to the ASC contract, HI Fraser at the moment I think is circa 14 million per annum and 10 million per annum in New South Wales, that first figure being in WA. I think HI Fraser has been down selected, as I understand it, for the mil-spec valves. But let me get some more detail offline. I'm happy to have a look at the particular issue that Chris has raised, but there might just be some probity issues around that as well. So I just need to have a bit better look at that, and we can come back through you, Joseph.
Thank you very much, Minister. Richard Harrison asks, will all 8 submarines be based in WA? Does this create a potential Pearl Harbor threat? I asked reluctantly.
Well, look, I think one of the interesting points of discussion is around where the US has its assets based in the region. And I mean, Guam has that potential because it's a very significant base for the United States, and it's obviously got close proximity to Taiwan, but I think they're very conscious of not, locating too many assets and creating a vulnerability, which is why in part Australia becomes attractive, as does potentially PNG and elsewhere. And similarly for us, you won't see 8 submarines located side by side up against the dock. I think you'll see, as we do with the Collins at the moment, a very strategic approach by the Chief of Navy to have some of those boats pre-positioned, generally a couple at least at sea at any one time. Might be 1 or 2 being repaired or having new systems installed, etc. But they, they'll be dispersed in a way that will negate that risk.
Murray Watts, who I assume is not Senator Murray Watts, says, how safe is it to have nuclear subs based in our pristine waters? What studies have been conducted to ensure the operation of them does not impact with whale migration and aquatic species?
Well, it's a good question, and I think if we look at the experience of the US and the UK, I mean, the UK, I think back to about 1952, when they started their program, neither the US or the UK has had an accident, and touch wood, they're very keen, clearly, for us to be able to develop the skill so that we can have the same safety record, and it's absolutely central to the negotiations. They call it stewardship, and they obviously don't want an accident because it would limit their potential to visit a port and engage across the world. And we're absolutely conscious of that, and as you can imagine, we're more than happy to sign up to all of that arrangement and the safety mechanisms and all of that, which I mean, it would be second nature for us to adopt all of those safety standards. So I think that's sort of that lived experience. There'll be plenty of studies around in terms of the impact on marine life, etc. But it's been without accident now for many decades, and we intend to utilise that technology their skills and learning, and make sure that we can replicate that safety record.
So Joan Andrews asks a non-sub related question, which is Australia going to order or build more drones for our military?
Yes, we are, and it's a fascinating technology. There are many countries that have, Israel, for example, an incredible program. But there are many companies in Australia who have, IP rights and constructing innovative platforms here. There's obviously, particularly in the maritime space, a lot of debate about underwater capability in unmanned vessels, and what capability that could bring to supplement the new platform or the new boat that we're buying. So yes, it's just the technology is quite remarkable, and there's the swarm technology that's available, AI learning that's central to the effective use of drones. It's a pretty exciting and a pretty daunting space, to be honest, but that's a very important part for the AUKUS agreement as well.
Victor Fang asks, and I'm just going to paraphrase, basically, it's about other national governments using social media, in some cases their own social media, like WeChat, for example, to impact and try and, I suppose, manipulate public opinion in democracies like Australia. Is there anything that we're doing to counter propaganda, or what's more commonly known as fake news? I was about to say something about publicly funded broadcasters, but I won't.
Don't mention the war. But look, I think this is one of the biggest issues that we have to contend with, because on a platform like WeChat, obviously encrypted, even the Prime Minister's own presence on WeChat is censored or restricted from time to time, and particularly for a younger demographic, but an older demographic as well. It's the way in which they communicate with people in China or elsewhere around the world. It's monitored, and there's, let's be very clear, an enormous amount of propaganda that's pumped out through a platform like WeChat. It's state influenced, and there are many operatives online, and there are many accounts of interference and the ways in which WeChat has been used, not in the way it was first intended. We've done a lot of work through the National Security Committee of Cabinet to make sure that we message out into the diaspora community that our problem is not with people of Chinese origin. Chinese Australians are some of the most wonderful migrants that have come to our country, contribute in an amazing way, work hard, educate their children, abide by the law, great small business people. Our problem is with the Communist Party of China, and we need to be very deliberate in our language, and it's the reality that through WeChat, through editorial content within some of the newspapers here as well, there's a lot of state view that is put, and we need to counter it, and it's a very difficult thing to do. People need to be aware of it. They need to be able to report it, and we need to be able to make that publicly available, to be honest, and give people examples of where it's out and out propaganda, it's not factually correct, and people shouldn't be guided by it.
So, Dutz, can you give us another 10 minutes, 10 or 15
yes,
minutes?
Of course. Yes,
Thank you.
Yes.
And Georgia, I'm hoping you can hang around for 15 minutes as well. So Adam Johnston has asked, it's a really good question, actually. I've got to say I've got a lot of sympathy for it. Did we miss a significant opportunity in ruling out a domestic nuclear industry? We only have a very old reactor at Lucas Heights.
Adam, good question. I mean, there's an enormous amount of debate around, as Jason pointed out before, in terms of climate, and continues to be an issue that we grapple with. People have got different views on nuclear, but I think those views predominantly have matured over many years. I think people again have seen the experience of other countries in terms of the use of nuclear power in a safe way, in a way that helps meet targets and dramatically reduces emissions, obviously. So I'll leave that to others, particularly Angus Taylor, whose job
So I think the answer, Adam, is that's someone else's problem.
But I just make this final point. I mean, the interesting thing is that it's important for us to have bipartisan support for the AUKUS agreement. It spans many years, maybe decades, as ANZUS has. ANZUS has been successful because it survived Democrat and Republican administrations, Liberal and Labor administrations here in Australia as well. And we wanted AUKUS to have that same theme. We didn't want it to be a partisan vehicle, and Labor wouldn't have supported it if it meant the creation of a domestic nuclear industry. The reactor technology now, as I pointed out before, means that we don't need that domestic industry, and that was an important consideration, because otherwise we wouldn't have had Labor signing up.
Richard Orr's made the point that in his view we need submarines now, not in 20 years. And I read somewhere else someone said that the Collins class has about 2 or 3 years more to go. So has the USA agreed to station submarines in Australian ports? If not, why not? As 80% of all Australian trade and imports travel by sea through the South China Sea, which can be blockaded by a foreign actor not acting in good faith.
Well, firstly, just to Richard's point, I mean, the Collins class, as we announced recently, is going to have a life of type extension. So it will, in 2026, the first of those boats will go into a life of type extension, which is a 2-year drumbeat, and those boats will then continue into service into the 2040s. It is actually a remarkably impressive technology and stealth capability that we've got in the Collins class. They had a very difficult start. We recall that very clearly, but the reality is now the way in which they've been rebuilt over a number of years means that they are probably the most effective boat, even against the Chinese vessels at the moment in our region. So don't underestimate the capability that we've already got in the Collins class. Second point is the Americans have given a commitment, if you like, that they will have a greater presence with their submarines, and the Brits as well. So that will give us some reassurance. But a big part of AUKUS is also the arrangement that we've entered into. We've committed $1 billion toward it already in relation to guided weapons, to missiles, to hypersonic, which again can provide cover that submarines might otherwise be able to provide. So our mechanisms are multi-layered, and if we could, base US submarines here tomorrow, I would be very strongly in favour of that. The Americans haven't come to that point yet. They may well do, but they've also got, the Russia threat for them to contemplate, similarly with the United Kingdom and NATO commitments as well in that regard. So it's about getting that balance right, and I think when you put all of that together, we've got a pretty significant capacity to deal with those choke points and to push out into South China Sea.
So GS says, I suppose he's being left with the impression that China is able to build submarines at a much faster rate than our Western allies can. Is there something you'd like to comment on there?
Well, it's correct, but I mean they put up buildings at a much greater pace than we do. Some of the buildings stay upright, some don't, and it's why I say that our Collins class, frankly, at the moment has a superiority underwater, even compared to some of the nuclear subs that the Chinese are operating. So, their technology, their capability is improving. They learn from their mistakes. There's no question about that. But is it best in class? No, it's not. And I think part of their hesitation at the moment is that they know the Americans have a very significant capability and, frankly, a few tricks up their sleeve that the Chinese would be rightly worried about.
Andrew Young asks, would you care to comment on the potential free trade agreement with Europe and the repercussions from France's unhappiness with us cancelling the submarine contract?
Well, it's been publicly reported that the PM was in the United States, in New York, at the same time Maurice and I were there. He was able to have a number of conversations, as Maurice did with her counterparts. They've made it very clear that the FTA discussion is a separate track than what we've seen in France's reaction and what that might mean for that relationship. So I think we continue to push on. It's not an easy negotiation for a number of reasons. It's a very complex agreement to put together. Dan Tehan, I think, is back into Europe next week from memory. So there's a lot of work that's gone on that'll continue to go on. I don't pretend that this has made it easier, but I think many of the Europeans have made it very clear that they see it as a separate lane of work.
So I've got three more questions and then I'll let you go. Jeff Green asked a really good question, which is, have we thought about what happens to the waste from the submarines, especially when they're decommissioned?
Well, it is a good question, Jeff. And it's part of the consideration around the 18-month process that we've entered into. And, there are options domestically, options internationally, but that is part of our discussion. It also depends on whether you're going with the Brits or the US, but we'll make an announcement in due course. But it's a very significant part of the discussion with the US and the UK now.
And Robert Giltnan asks, the Quad has obviously now become even more important. Given New Zealand's current approach to Micronesia and Polynesia, do you see Australia working more closely with other allied states, particularly Japan? I should warn you, Minister, if this is the Rob Giltnan I know, he also married a French woman, so he knows something about dealing with the French. Sorry.
Well, I think the relationship with Japan is as strong as it's ever been, and sometimes that's sort of flippantly said, but it really is. They've obviously got a transition underway at the moment and an election, so they're understandably distracted by that. But I think, as you saw in Washington, there's a very close relationship with the Japanese and with the Indians. I mean, the Indians really, I think, have come a long way and are now a very, very strong partner of the Quad. They're worried about incursions, obviously, across their border with China. They're worried about the build-up of infrastructure along that border, and they are along with the Japanese, key partners in the Quad. So Japan is very worried about East China Sea, and the point I made before about the incursions into their territory, and the Chinese have been very forward-leaning in that part of the world. So the Japanese are a very important partner.
And the final question really is a combination of people, but Richard Harrison says he's currently reading Churchill's History of World War II. Germany ignored all treaties enforced on it, and France, UK appeased and didn't say no in 34-35. The result was Germany got too powerful. World War II resulted. Now, of course, as you know, Aspie has also said that there are parallels with Europe in the 1930s. How do you think those parallels resonate in our region at the moment?
Really good question. Both the Prime Minister and I have used the analogy of the 1930s as well, and we use it carefully and advisedly. There are many people who are compromised by the relationship with China, just given the sheer might of their economic capability and their investment into people and infrastructure in different countries. I alluded to some of that before. Some people still have their head in the sand about where China is, and don't see any threat at all or any concern in the militarisation of ports and the build-up of this military might, the increase in their in their stocks, particularly nuclear, as we've seen reported recently. So I think from an Australian perspective, we are on the right course. We were on the right course when we made the decision in relation to 5G. China didn't like that. They pushed back on it very strongly. We said we didn't want Huawei and ZTE in the network because the amount of interference and cyber attack was just unprecedented, and it was inconceivable that you could have a telecommunications network compromised by a state actor. And we've continued on, I think, with our principled approach, and I think it holds us in good stock. I hope it provides an example to some others within our region. And only a few years ago, we were probably in the same position, to be frank, and we've been punished over the course of the last few years. I think business now has decided to find different markets, and but I'll just finish on this note. I hope that we can normalise the relationship as quickly as possible, but Xi Jinping is a very different leader, and he's been very deliberate about what he wants to achieve in his own lifetime. And I think, unlike in the 1930s, there's a lot more dissemination of information available to people around the world, and there are many countries, including in Europe at the moment, who are actively pushing back on China because they're worried about the direction they're headed in. And the last thing any of us want is conflict in our region or anywhere else. And I hope that our actions, our principled actions, contribute to stability and continuing peace in our region, and that's ultimately what we hope for.
Thank you, Minister. I'm now going to call on Georgia Ryburn to give the vote of thanks. Georgia.
Thanks, Jason. Minister Dutton, on behalf of the Northern Beaches LGC, Mackellar FEC, as well as the 150 or so guests here this evening, I wanted to sincerely thank you for your time this evening, for answering our questions, and of course for the work and service you give to our nation. I found it particularly interesting hearing about not only the subs but also the drone strategy as well as unpacking the geography and building plans for AUKUS, and also the need for upskilling for this. And particularly interesting, as you mentioned at the beginning, your emphasis on technology, on AI, quantum computing, as well as cybersecurity. And I suspect your cybersecurity is just so good, it didn't allow you to actually get into Microsoft Teams this evening. Now, I did have a question that I wanted to ask, although it's a bit frivolous, but my question was going to be, who came up with the name AUKUS? Because as we know, AUKUS, and as we know, names are significant. They mean something. They symbolise who we are, and in this case, they also symbolise our relationship and unity with our allies and friends in the UK and the US. And so I think it's particularly interesting and fitting that your name, Peter, means rock or sturdy ground. So again, on behalf of all of the guests here this evening, I wanted to thank you for being a rock for our nation in your work, in your ministerialship in defence, but also through the service that you've given our country over the past 2 decades and beyond. We sincerely thank you, Minister Dutton. Back to you, Jason.
Thank you, Georgia. So, Peter, I've got to say, in years gone by, I used to be in M&A, and always the biggest discussions was what to name the project when we were doing things. So, do you have any story behind that?
Well, firstly, thank you very much, Georgia, for very kind remarks and for being easy on me in terms of my inability for proper use of technology tonight. I've used Teams all day and it's worked adequately, so I'm not sure what's gone wrong here. So my apologies to everyone for that. Now, the best answer that I can give to you is that more credit goes to the Prime Minister, and as a loyal cabinet minister, I'm sure that you would know that I'm most sincere in saying that it was our dear leader, I think, that came up with the AUKUS moniker, and if it wasn't, then I think he should still be praised for it in any case. So I think it may have come out of the department, but ultimately approved by the PM. So it's been derided in some newspapers and whatnot, but it sums it up pretty well, and it just shows the closeness of these 3 partners, and hopefully that continues for a long time to come, because it's in our national interest for it to be the case.
So the last thing I'll say before I say goodbye tonight, or good night to you, is a former high-ranking official in the Royal Australian Navy has just texted me a photo of the submarine coming out of the water from the Hunt for Red October in that final scene. And I have a sneaking suspicion that ratings of the Hunt for Red October on streaming services would have gone through the roof after you made this announcement. So congratulations and well done. And a lot of people in the chat function have been thanking you in particular for your clear-eyed and precise way in which you've described this deal. So thank you for your time tonight, Peter. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure, mate. Thank you. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye. Ladies and gentlemen, on that note, can I thank you? We'll be starting the Google conference in 11 minutes. So those of you who want to hang around, please do so. Bye.